Now is one of the country's most vocal proponents of gun safety reform, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Senator Murphy, great to see you Labor Day weekend. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
So we've been hearing versions of closing a gun show loophole for some time now. A lot of us, you've been talking about it for years. Do you think there's a greater appetite to do this now? And what are you hearing from Republican colleagues that's encouraging?
Well, of course, this is such an exceptional issue in American politics today. The public has made up their mind. They want universal background checks. It polls at 85, 90, 95% approval in this country. You don't get that kind of approval rating for grandma or apple pie or baseball. It's like the most popular thing in the United States, making sure that criminals and people with serious mental illness don't have guns. And it's just been so frustrating and maddening to voters at the top of the list as to why Congress hasn't been able to get it done. But as you mentioned, in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act last year, we did make a pretty important change. We made it clear that anybody that's in the business of selling guns, even if it's a part-time business, has to be licensed and has to perform background checks. And so the Biden administration announced just this week that they are going to be implementing that section of the bill, and it is likely going to result in literally tens of thousands of guns that right now are sold without background checks having background checks applied. And that means there's going to be a lot fewer criminals, a lot fewer people with mental illness who are going to be able to find loopholes around the background check law to get their hands on a firearm. And that is predominantly people who are selling, maybe 20, 30, 40 guns a year at a gun show or online that weren't doing background checks before, who are now going to have to perform background checks. And by the way, 5-minute background checks that don't stop any law-abiding gun owner from getting their hands on a weapon.
One of the other big challenges, to state the obvious, as of late, is what the FBI director has been saying for years, that racially motivated violent extremism is the largest threat to our country. I know you've talked about this. Unfortunately, we've seen white supremacy as a primary motivator of a number of mass shootings in the last few years, including recently in Jacksonville. But the violent rhetoric from not just Trump, but some of the other leading candidates continues to escalate. In addition to what you're trying to do in Congress, what can we actually do about this as a country?
Well, I think there's two important things to say here. First is there is a direct through line between the glorification and endorsement of violence that is happening in right-wing political circles and the usage of violence against Black, brown, gay, lesbian, transgender Americans. The folks who are out there glorifying violence that are part of Trump's movement, they are sending a signal of endorsement to people who think that they can deal with the demons by taking out violence on people that they hate. But the second piece of this is related to your opening. You talked about this scapegoating of the mentally ill. It's really important to point out that you don't have to be mentally ill to be racist. There are plenty of people who are not mentally ill, who are hateful and prejudiced towards minorities and vulnerable populations in this country. And so it is just not true to look at many of these hate crimes and just write that away as a consequence of mental illness. There's a difference between mental illness and racism, and the folks that are distributing this racist hate material, they have to be held accountable for that.
So back in Congress, I know the Senate is not back quite yet, but of course, there's lots of thought about what's going to happen when you do return. Majority Leader Schumer said in his Dear Colleague letter that the focus will be on funding the government and preventing House Republican extremists from forcing a government shutdown. For people who are just tuning into that possibility, there are threats of an impeachment inquiry into President Biden. Do you think that will be the holdup in getting government funded through the House? Or what are the issues that will be really debated here?
Well, it would be an absolute tragedy as this economy is recovering, as we are seeing record job growth, as we are seeing wages rise, for the government to shut down because of right-wing Republican demands. That is the last thing our economy needs right now. The truth of the matter is that we can keep the government up and operating. We can get a budget, but it's going to be without those 100 or 150 most radical Republicans in the House of Representatives. There is a coalition of Democrats and a handful of reasonable Republicans in the House, along with the Senate, that can pass a budget. And that really is just a question as to whether Kevin McCarthy is willing to stand up to those right wingers who are clamoring for impeachment, or he is going to let them run the business, not just of the House of Representatives, but run the business of the United States of America. That's a question he'll have to answer in the next 30 days.
Taking it to the presidential race, there's polling that shows Joe Biden and Donald Trump tied in a head-to-head race. It is very, very early, and Trump actually takes the lead when you include third-party candidates. We go through kind of ebbs and flows of talking about the threat of third-party candidates. And I just wanted to ask you, you're a savvy political guy, how concerned do you think people should be about a third-party spoiler? Is it something that you're concerned about?
Well, we certainly look back to prior presidential elections like 2000 and, come to the conclusion that some of these third-party candidates were dispositive. I do think we're in a bit of a different time right now. I think the stakes are higher. I think it's less likely that voters are going to throw away their vote on a third-party candidate when we actually get to the election day. Sometimes people are more willing to suggest they'll vote for a third-party candidate in early polls, less willing when it actually comes down to decision time. But I think Joe Biden's going to do incredibly well. I think he's going to probably run against Donald Trump. I think he's going to beat Donald Trump by a bigger margin than in the last election. And I think that's because he's going to have a pretty incredible record to run on. And there are going to be issues like abortion that are going to drive even more voters, especially young voters, out to the polls in 2024 than came out in 2020. And I think that our success in passing things like the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is proof to those young voters that when they turn out and vote for Democrats, we actually can get things done that matter to them on issues like guns, choice, and climate. So I'm not worried about the 2024 election. I think you'll see a lot of these close polls, but when the choice is made by voters, I think Joe Biden's going to do incredibly well.
There are few people I can do a tour of the world with, but you are one of them. So I wanted to ask you quickly before I let you go, you're on the Foreign Relations Committee. There's reporting that some weapons being sent to the front lines in Ukraine are ending up in Russian hands. How do you feel about the accounting you've been given about the status of that? Do you want more information? Do you feel satisfied with what you have?
So I feel very good about the accounting. I mean, let's be honest. The front lines are dangerous, chaotic places. In every single conflict, there have been weapons that end up changing hands, in part because territory changes hands. But what I have seen thus far, the information that I have been given, tells me that the Ukrainians have been incredibly thoughtful and responsible in the usage of the weapons that we have given to them. I think what you're going to see is a lot of opponents of the Ukraine war, of supporting Ukraine in this war, propagandists around Vladimir Putin who are going to try to come up with lots of excuses as to why we shouldn't give weapons to the Ukrainians. But one of those reasons is not their end usage. The Ukrainians have been incredibly responsible, and we should continue to support them.
Senator Chris Murphy, thank you for the tour of the world. Politics, gun violence, Ukraine. Can't do that with everybody. Really appreciate your time today. We're coming right back after a quick